Welcome to the Unsolved Mystery YouTube channel and our exclusive series, Jonbenet's Web Truths. On this evening's episode, we will be featuring the May 8th, 2001 MSNBC special, The Intruder Theory, with legendary detective Smit. But as we do, without any further ado, let's get right into this.
Tonight, the Jonbenet murder, The Intruder Theory.
Here now is Katie Couric.
Good evening. You may have thought you've heard it all about the murder of Jonbenet Ramsey, but tonight we'll be showing you evidence never televised before that may make you think twice about what you thought you knew. You'll hear from a well-respected detective who resigned from the case after 18 months because he says those in charge weren't listening to him. Tonight we are, as he takes us back to the crime scene, the house in Boulder, Colorado, where 6-year-old Jonbenet was murdered, Christmas night, 1996.
I didn't do it. John Ramsey didn't do it, and we didn't have a clue of anybody who did do it.
This is never-before-seen videotape of Patsy Ramsey on her third day of the police interrogation about the murder of her daughter, Jonbenet.
This child was the most precious thing in my life. And I can't stand the thought of thinking somebody's out here walking on the street. God knows they might do it again to some other child.
Now, after 4.5 years, this man says there are important clues the police have ignored that he feels will exonerate the Ramseys after all.
Katie, the evidence shows very strongly that there's evidence of somebody else doing this, and it's credible evidence.
That evidence includes this open window, this garrote, this suitcase, this footprint, these possible stun gun marks. Each taken alone might not mean much, but taken as a whole, Detective Smit says, it's an altogether different story. A widely respected Colorado detective, he was at the center of the Jonbenet investigation for 1.5 years. Despite all you've heard since the murder, Smit claims the evidence shows someone other than John or Patsy Ramsey took the life of this 6-year-old girl.
I just can't turn my back on what I see to be the truth.
In Colorado law enforcement circles, Smit is considered something of a legend. Boulder Sheriff's Department Detective Steve Ainsworth.
He takes the evidence and sees where the evidence goes. He's a tenacious investigator. A lot of people say he's the best there is.
The best there is, his supporters say, because of his 33-year career helping to solve more than 200 murder cases, including the killing of Colorado teenager Heather Dawn Church. Smit's investigation cleared the girl's father, who had been a suspect. An intruder was convicted of the crime. But Smit retired in the early 1990s, or so he thought. 3.5 months after Jonbenet's murder, Smit was called back into action by the Boulder County District Attorney's Office.
I thought it was going to be a slam dunk, Katie. I thought this was going to be an easy case.
Another day brings more tidbits of information in the...
After all, he followed the early media coverage just like everyone else. He'd heard that the Ramseys were uncooperative with the police, that there were rumors of sexual abuse, that the ransom note was a fake, that there were no signs of forced entry, and he knew that in the murder of a child, the parents are always prime suspects. According to the Justice Department, only 1 in 12 child murders is committed by a stranger. Smit showed me around the Ramseys' former home in Boulder, now owned by friends who want this story told. Smit says once on the case, he quickly discovered he couldn't believe everything he had heard or seen, like the footage that seemed to show no evidence of an intruder the night of the murder.
I even thought to myself, how could anyone get into the house without leaving some type of a footprint in the snow?
But then he saw the actual crime scene photographs taken the morning after the murder.
And then once we got the photographs, then you could see that there was no snow around the various doors and entry doors of the house.
Or the sidewalks.
Or on the sidewalks either. That's correct.
So the whole idea that no footprints meant no intruder to you was not necessarily true.
No, not once we seen the photos.
But another crime scene photo had already caught his attention.
The very first photograph that I seen of that basement window, the window was wide open. And I said, wait a minute, take a look at that. That was one of the light bulbs that went off and one of the red flags that I seen.
Some thought the open window was irrelevant because no one could get through it. Or could they? Even Smit, who's 66 and 5 feet 9, could pull it off.
Yes, I've been in there several times myself, and even a large person can get in there.
Why don't you show me how you believe it happened?
You notice, Katie, that this is an area that's real hidden from view. There's fences all around, and this is a perfect place to go in because nobody can see me.
According to Smit, there are signs that someone had disturbed the leaves in the window well and of what he calls finger marks on one of the window panes, possibly from someone wearing a glove. He also points to what he believes to be a shoe scuff on the wall, and he says there are imprints of a high-tech brand boot, apparently not owned by any family member, in the wine cellar where Jonbenet's body was found. And he says a suitcase placed under the window to help an intruder get out. Wouldn't there have been footprints then on the suitcase?
To me, I do see an area that looks like a very partial footprint.
But the intruder theory still raises many questions. If someone were in their home, how could John and Patsy Ramsey not have heard anything from their bedroom while their daughter was dying a violent death? A neighbor across the street reported hearing a fairly shocking child's cry between midnight and 2 a.m.
Yes, that's correct.
Many have said, if that's the case, then why didn't John and Patsy Ramsey hear it as well?
And that's a very good question to ask.
Smit says he has an answer, and it has to do with the unusual design of the Ramsey home. He says the parents would have heard nothing because Jonbenet was murdered all the way down in the basement, 3 floors below. But how did a neighbor hear a scream that the parents did not? Smit points to a vent pipe in the basement boiler room, where he says the most brutal part of the attack took place.
This has an open end in the basement and also an open end to the outside. It acts almost like a megaphone. Myself and other investigators have stood in the basement and whistled and yelled, and you can hear it clearly at the Stanton residence and could barely hear it upstairs.
We walked upstairs to John and Patsy Ramsey's former bedroom. This is where John and Patsy Ramsey's bed was. And if the intruder theory has any legs, then you believe they wouldn't hear the scream that the neighbor across the street heard.
That's correct. And if you'll also notice, even the windows on the side, they're very thick, double-strength windows. And there's no window on that particular side of the house where the scream would exit out that vent.
But even if you accept all that, there's another question. When would an intruder have had time to get into the house without anyone knowing? On Christmas Day, late in the afternoon, John and Patsy Ramsey took Jonbenet and their son Burke to a Christmas party at the home of friends. The Ramseys were not home for several hours and say they returned around 9:30 that night. Lou Smit believes that the intruder came in while the Ramseys were out at that party. Not sure exactly how long the intruder lay in wait, Smit believes the killer would have climbed these back stairs from the basement, might have hidden in an extra bedroom on the second floor, and later entered Jonbenet's room after the entire family had fallen asleep.
People say that there was only 4 people in the house that day. What the case tells me is that there's a 5th personality there. There's a 5th personality that is a very brutal, vicious personality that killed Jonbenet.
Smit says he was further convinced his intruder theory had merit because he could not find any motive for a Ramsey family member to kill Jonbenet.
There is no past behavior on the Ramsey's part after 4 years and everybody in the world looking at them that shows that the Ramseys had any motive to kill their daughter or that they would go off the deep end.
But in your experience, don't good people sometimes do just terrible things? What about when people just, for whatever reason, snap?
Yes, that does happen.
And they are sort of model citizens, church-going, good people, solid individuals. Everybody loves them, great neighbors.
Katie, you're absolutely right. But usually when you look into the background of those cases, there is a pathology there of some type. In a Ramsey's case, I can't find any pathology at all.
But Steve Thomas, a former detective with the Boulder Police Department, had another theory about the way Jonbenet was murdered and wrote a book about it. He alleges the little girl wet her bed that night, causing Patsy Ramsey to fly into a rage and kill her daughter. It's been said that because Jonbenet wet her bed, Patsy Ramsey flew into a fit of rage.
There has never been any record at all of Patsy ever losing her temper over Jonbenet's bedwetting. None whatsoever.
Well, how would anyone know, frankly?
The family would know. The friends would probably know. Jonbenet would probably tell somebody if there was some type of pathology there. The housekeepers would know.
What's more, Smit says the crime scene evidence disputes the bedwetting allegation.
The photographs show that there is no bedwetting. The photograph shows no staining of those sheets. Lab reports don't show any bedwetting or the sheets being urine stained.
So if Patsy Ramsey didn't fly into a fit of rage and kill her daughter that night, how did this murder unfold? According to Lou Smit, the violence began with a weapon like this.
The stun gun is a very important part of this puzzle, and it points very strongly at an intruder.
When we return, Smith's stun gun theory and the kind of man he believes would have used it.
Jonbenet was a pedophile's dream come true.
On Christmas morning 1996, the last morning of her life, Jonbenet Ramsey looked like any innocent, carefree 6-year-old. But when most of us hear the name Jonbenet, we think of this, the tiny beauty queen.
Jonbenet, thank you.
In the weeks and months following this murder, many people saw videotape of Jonbenet over and over again, and they thought, this is a little sick to dress this little girl up in high heels and makeup and have her prance around in clothes that frankly looked almost inappropriate. Is that a fair observation to make about this family, that that's a little sick or not?
I don't think that is fair.
Would you agree that that contributed to the perception that the Ramseys might have been involved?
Absolutely. I'm not saying all the world, but the majority of the people perceive the Ramseys to be guilty, not because of evidence, but because of perception.
But whatever people think, the fact that Jonbenet was highly visible plays a critical role in Lou Smit's intruder theory. Smit says she may have become the object of a sexual predator's fantasy.
She's a beautiful girl. She did special performances just before Christmas, not only in her school, but she was also in a very highly publicized event of the Christmas season. Jonbenet had her own float, Little Miss Colorado. Jonbenet was a pedophile's dream come true.
In fact, soon after the murder, Los Angeles Sheriff's Department child abuse expert Lieutenant Tom Circle told NBC News that public exposure like this raises the risk of a child being targeted.
I've searched hundreds of homes, residents, businesses of child molesters, child pornographers, and found pictures of kids from around the world. And when you see some ads or you see photographs of minor children where they're posed in a sexy way, is fuel for a child molester.
This is home video taken in a Boulder shopping mall a few days before Christmas, Jonbenet's last public performance. Her parents were public too. John Ramsey's business success was reported in the local paper just days before Christmas. The Ramseys had hosted 3 Christmas parties that month involving hundreds of people. 2 of them were held in their home.
The Ramseys were highly visible at the time of the murder.
But if Lou Smit's theory of an intruder is true, who was this individual?
This is a brutal, brutal murder. The type of killing and the brutality of the killing show me that this man is a sadistic pedophile.
But how did he get away with murder as Jonbenet's family slept in the same house? In a crucial part of his theory, Smit believes the intruder got Jonbenet from her bed by incapacitating her with a stun gun, a small battery-operated device designed to fend off attackers. Smit says the killer then took the child to the basement.
I believe he brought her down to the farthest, deepest part of that basement and did very brutal things to her.
These autopsy photos provided to NBC News show that Jonbenet had 2 distinct sets of marks on her face and back.
Stun gun marks are very specific, very specific. Once you know what they look like, it's not hard to distinguish what they are.
Speculation about a stun gun has been swirling around ever since Jonbenet was murdered. The Boulder Police Department has neither confirmed nor denied its use in this crime, but the department did ask Dr. Michael Doberson, a forensic pathologist and coroner, to study the marks on Jonbenet.
Unless some other evidence is presented to me, the most likely explanation for those injuries is that they were caused by a stun gun.
And Lou Smit uses these photos to further advance his theory. This man, whose body was exhumed, was confirmed to have been stun-gunned on his face, and this young woman was stun-gunned on her face as well. He says their marks are similar to the ones found on Jonbenet.
You have to explain the fresh marks on Jonbenet, especially on her face. They weren't seen in any of the Christmas photos or any of the photographs taken that day of Jonbenet. This is a very important clue left behind by the killer, Katie. You just can't throw a clue like that away.
Smit says there aren't many other explanations and does not believe they were caused by buttons or snaps, as others have theorized.
Not only do the marks on the back look like each other, but they're a certain distance apart, approximately 3.5 centimeters apart. The marks on the face are approximately 3.5 centimeters apart. What are the odds of having two sets of marks on a person just by randomly laying on an object, say as a button or anything of that nature, or a snap?
There is no evidence the Ramseys ever owned a stun gun, but hundreds of thousands of Americans do. More than 600 police departments use them, and they're easily available at gun stores and on the internet. They don't need to be registered. And Lou Smit says he did extensive research on the weapons. He found one he says would most closely match the marks on Jonbenet, an air taser gun applied directly to the skin. Some people aren't very familiar with stun guns, certainly don't know the noise they make. And so I'd like you to show us if you could.
First of all, the stun gun does make a lot of noise.
So how could the Ramseys sleep through that? Lou Smit says he now knows because he conducted tests on anesthetized pigs.
Until we got to the actual experiments with the pigs, we didn't realize that a stun gun, when it's applied right directly to the skin of the pig, that the noise is very muted. This is what it sounds like when it's against a pillow. It's very muted when it's against the skin. That's what it sounds like. And even more so when it was on the pig.
But as much as Lou Smit believes his stun gun theory is relevant, he says it certainly didn't win many converts at the Boulder Police Department. So why were people so hesitant about accepting this stun gun theory?
I suppose it's because it didn't fit into the promoting the Ramseys did it part of the equation.
Some people have called you a delusional old man.
I like to look at it as being a seasoned investigator. I know that that was said early on in the investigation. If that's the case, I must have changed overnight, because that has not been the case in the past.
Lou Smit's supporters say he's onto something. Up next, new details about the way he believes Jonbenet died. Was the garrote used for some kind of weird sexual act, or was it used as a killing device?
I think it was both.
Intruder theory. Here again, Katie Couric.
As we return to Detective Lou Smit's theory about an intruder in the Ramsey murder case, he describes what he says was a sexual predator's horrific attack on the 6-year-old girl. A note of caution, some of what you're about to see and hear is graphic and disturbing.
Why he did all these things, I don't know. But Jonbenet died a very brutal death in the furthest corner of the basement of that house. And then she was thrown into a moldy room. Katie, this area is blocked off now, but this used to be a door that led into the wine cellar.
And this is where Jonbenet's body was
That's
discovered.
where her body was found. And it's only a very short distance from here to there.
Lou Smit says once the intruder got Jonbenet into the wine cellar, he used a carefully made garrote, fashioned from nylon cord and a broken paintbrush taken from this tray in the basement. And if there were ever any doubts about how brutal the murder was, these autopsy photos provided to NBC News lay them to rest.
This final garrote positioning is very deeply embedded in the neck of JonBenet.
Lou Smit believes she was strangled first, that the fingernail marks around the ligature suggest she was conscious and struggling at the time. Was the garrote used for some kind of weird sexual act, or was it used as a killing device?
I think it was both. He was fantasizing about using this on JonBenet. He placed it around her neck, he was controlling her, and violently applied it to strangle her. And she was trying to get it off of her neck.
The autopsy photos also show a large skull fracture, and Smit says this grievous injury actually occurred toward the end of the attack.
The person who did this wanted to brutally kill JonBenet. That was probably one of the last things that this person did prior to throwing her in that room.
Dr. Michael Doberson, a Colorado coroner, was asked by the Boulder Police Department to examine the autopsy photos of JonBenet. He concurs with Smit and says she was struck on the head after she was strangled. Why? He says such a blow to the head would normally result in much more internal bleeding in the brain. But because the garrote cut off blood supply to the brain, it kept bleeding there to a minimum.
I would disagree with the theory of the Boulder police that any of the changes that are seen at autopsy associated with the ligature strangulation are staged in any way.
Smit says this photo of the nylon rope found on JonBenet's hands is another important clue.
Just the way that the ligature on her hands was constructed, again, is a fantasy in the mind of this killer. This wasn't just tied on her wrist with little granny knots on both sides and the rope tied there.
And in a key element of his theory, Smit says JonBenet was the victim of a sexual assault. Remember this paint tray from which Smit claims the killer took the paintbrush to fashion the garrote? He believes the end of that paintbrush was used to sexually assault the little girl.
JonBenet was sexually penetrated that night. Somebody went between her legs and put something there with such force that it caused her to bleed. There was, in her vagina, what has been suspected to be maybe even a small piece of that broken paintbrush.
Smit believes the rest of that piece of broken paintbrush was taken by the intruder as a souvenir.
The paintbrush is actually broken into three pieces. There's a brush end, which is found in the basement. There's a middle portion, which is found in the handle of the garrote. And there's a third portion of that paintbrush, which is missing. It has not been found in the house.
Smit says all these things added together point to an intruder, not a family member committing the crime.
Now, why a family member would have to take their child down to a dirty, filthy, cluttered basement and murder her in the farthest reaches of this basement, sure, you can say it could happen, but the chances of that happening, I believe, are extremely remote.
Isn't there always a first time?
Sure, there's a first time. But again, it would have to be a first time for everything in this case, if that was the case.
What about the theory that somehow this was some kind of perverse sexual act committed by John Ramsey?
Sure.
That went awry?
If you look at the end of the branch, you could say that anything is possible. But you have to also look at a man's past history. There is absolutely no, even a hint of any type of sexual impropriety on the part of John Ramsey.
JonBenet's autopsy report mentions chronic inflammation in her vagina. Some medical experts have said this could be a sign of long-term abuse. Others say the inflammation could have been caused by almost anything, including bubble baths. There's no debate there are pieces of evidence left at the crime scene. Fibers, hair, and DNA. Evidence Smit says doesn't match up with anyone in the Ramsey family.
It can point a very strong finger at who may have done it. Also, they found DNA in JonBenet's panties. She had bled during the sexual assault portion of the crime. Again, primary source, they know that's JonBenet. It was her blood. But there is also secondary source of DNA. Again, foreign, and it matches the DNA in the fingernails of her hands. This is now in 3 areas.
When you say foreign, it means not belonging to John, Patsy, or Burke Ramsey.
That's right.
And Smit points to a single hair found on the blanket covering JonBenet's body.
Could it just be a random hair? Sure. But could it be the killer? Yes.
This hair did not belong to any of the Ramseys.
That's right.
There were reports that there were red fibers found on Jonbenet that matched a sweater Patsy Ramsey was wearing.
Yes, Patsy Ramsey was sitting on the same blanket probably that night when she changed Jonbenet's clothing. I'm not saying that you should throw this evidence away. You just have to give it the weight that it's supposed to. And in court, if it ever would go to court, this would be argued back and forth.
But so far, no one has been tried for this crime. And Smit claims what's crucial in catching the killer is the evidence he says Jonbenet's murderer did not leave behind. The piece of broken paintbrush, the stun gun, and the duct tape that was used to cover her mouth. When we return, Lou Smit's take on perhaps the single most important piece of evidence used to implicate Patsy Ramsey in the murder of her daughter.
The person that wrote that note shows his personality in that note. Very brutal and very vicious.
Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. We have your daughter in our possession. You stand a 99% chance of killing your daughter if you try to outsmart us. Chilling words from the Jonbenet Ramsey ransom note, reportedly found by Patsy Ramsey on these stairs inside their home.
She came down these stairs and seen the ransom note on the bottom step.
4.5 years later, the note remains perhaps the most critical and perplexing piece of evidence in the ongoing murder investigation.
The person that wrote that note shows his personality in that note. Very brutal and very vicious.
According to Smit, a number of phrases from the note are taken from movies with storylines that revolve around kidnapping and murder, a case of life imitating art. Movies like Ruthless People.
If you deviate from our instructions in any way whatsoever, she will be killed.
Any deviation of my instructions will result in the immediate execution of your daughter, a phrase from the Ramsey ransom note. And from the movie Speed.
Do not attempt to grow a brain.
Compared to Don't Try to Grow a Brain in the Ramsey ransom note. And Smit points out the movie Ransom was playing in Boulder at the time, a film with eerie similarities to Jonbenet's murder. A 6-year-old boy is kidnapped, his mouth covered with duct tape, his hands tied.
Whoever wrote this note was thinking of those particular type of movies. It's like a PhD in ransom notes that was gained through watching movies.
Smit acknowledges that while the author apparently practiced writing the note while inside the home, he also believes the writer had a definite idea of what he wanted to say.
The note itself shows that this was a very controlled, planned, sophisticated ransom note. It's not like a note is written in panic after brutally murdering your child. Why would a parent have to write a 2.5-page ransom note? Why would they have to put in all of these references to ransom-type movies?
Why? To cover up their own crime.
Sure. If they're a sophisticated criminal, I can see them doing that, Katie. These people do not have any type of criminal record at all.
Smit believes it was a sophisticated criminal who entered the home through this basement window while the Ramseys were at a Christmas party. Perhaps one of the most frequently asked questions, Lou, is why would an intruder sit down and write a lengthy ransom note with no clue as to when the family was coming home? I mean, wouldn't that be awfully risky?
Well, if the intruder had plenty of time in the house to begin with, he would have all the time he needed to write a ransom note. There's a certain type of high-risk criminal that does that.
It's part of the thrill.
It's part of the thrill, you bet. And I think when we finally catch him, which I think we still have a very good chance to do, that we're going to find that he's been arrested for some type of sexual offense in his past.
If an intruder wrote this ransom note, was this a kidnapping gone bad?
What I found in the majority of the cases I've worked is there's a very simple rule. The case is as it seems to be. Don't make it complicated. If it's reported as a kidnapping and a murder, perhaps it is a kidnapping and a murder.
Boulder Sheriff's Detective Steve Ainsworth, who worked the Ramsey investigation, has his theories. Many people say, how could an intruder hang around the house and write this long, elaborate ransom note? That's pretty risky stuff.
Very risky.
How do you answer that?
Could be part of the thrill for him. The risk of getting caught.
Why write the ransom note then?
It could have been a pedophile who didn't want any money, but he wanted Jonbenet.
There's one section that some believe points a finger at John and Patsy Ramsey. You will withdraw $118,000 from your account. $100,000 will be in $100 bills, and the remaining $18,000 in $20 bills. $118,000 has been the source of a lot of attention because that was the amount of John Ramsey's Christmas bonus. Is that right?
It was close to what the net amount was.
So people think, where did that number come from?
Yes. And why would they put in a figure that would point right back at themselves? We don't know why the killer put that in his note.
Could the killer have been an employee or have had some association with Access Graphics, John Ramsey's company? Did John or Patsy Ramsey purposely try to implicate a disgruntled employee? Smit says both are possible, but that the relatively small amount of money demanded remains a mystery to him. According to investigators, handwriting analyses have ruled out John Ramsey as the writer of the note. Patsy Ramsey could not be completely ruled out, though.
No, Patsy Ramsey cannot be completely ruled out. She does have certain characteristics which are close in nature to that on the note. But what some of the examiners have said, and the majority of them, is that there are many more differences. In other words, it's not a positive at all that Patsy Ramsey wrote that note.
In fact, it's measured from 1 to 5, and she scored a 4.5, unlikely to have written the note.
Yes.
Which leaves a 0.5 possibility that she did.
Absolutely. There's a 0.5 possibility.
On a 1 to 5 scale, that would mean there's a 90% chance someone else wrote the ransom note.
It starts off, Mr. Ramsey, which I think for a kidnapper is pretty polite. Do you find that at all unusual?
I find this whole thing unusual, okay?
Smit says he believes that gives his intruder theory even more credence. The Boulder Police Department has always contended it has investigated all leads, yet Smit insists the police never really pursued the intruder theory.
The Boulder Police Department has focused on the Ramseys. Some people call it tunnel vision. Perhaps that's the case. They have just stopped at the Ramseys. Plain and simple. They've gone to the Ramseys and they've stopped.
But Lou Smit has been accused of being too much on the Ramseys' side. One beef about you is that at one point you prayed with the Ramseys.
Yes.
That you're a religious individual, that they're religious, and that somehow that clouded your judgment.
I know, I've read that also. It is part of my personality and the way I work a case. When I pull on the crime scene, the first thing I say is a prayer. When I end a case, that's the last thing I do. I started my day at the Ramsey home with a commitment to Jonbenet and a small prayer. The way that it happened with my praying with the Ramseys was completely spontaneous. I did mention to John that I just said a small prayer for Jonbenet, and he asked me if I'd say a prayer with him. And I said, sure, John, I'd be glad to do that. And there was probably two reasons for that. One, I would offer compassion to this family, and that's my style of doing things. But the second reason is that I wanted to build a bridge with the Ramseys so that they would come across and supply information to the police department and to the district attorney's office later. It's not the first time I've done that, Katie. We're just going to go get some more equipment. All right.
Others say Smit is reliving a case from his past when a father was suspected of murdering his teenage daughter. He was eventually cleared after Smit investigated and found an intruder was responsible. Some have said that because of the Heather Dawn Church case, that you are sort of intruder obsessed and that you, in fact, are the myopic one.
If the evidence is there, Katie, that's what I follow. In the Heather Dawn Church case, there was an intruder. At first, the parents were blamed for that crime, too.
When it comes to the Ramsey case, Smit says he is not being paid by anyone, but continues to work it on his own. The Ramseys have assembled their own team of investigators who have worked on the case on their behalf, paid by them.
Yes.
And you have worked with them at times. Is that kosher? in your line of work or for what you're doing to be working in concert with people who are on the Ramsey payroll?
Yes, I have no problem with that at all. My goal is to find the killer of Jonbenet. And if I have to work with the Ramsey investigators to do that, I'm going to do that.
When we return, Lou Smit's intruder theory. Are other experts buying it?
We'll continue after this brief message. Katie Couric.
There are countless law enforcement officials, journalists, and millions of curious Americans who have followed every twist and turn in the Jonbenet murder case. Not surprisingly, Lou Smit's theory has reignited the debate over just who killed the 6-year-old girl. You believe he familiarized himself? In recent days, even some skeptics say Lou Smit's intruder theory is an impressive piece of detective work. Investigative journalist Lawrence Schiller, who interviewed scores of participants in the case, is the author of a best-selling book about the Jonbenet murder.
There is no question that Mr. Smit's scenario, the way he puts his presentation together, is very, very powerful. It could sway a jury. It certainly did sway the grand jury that did not indict the Ramseys.
But Schiller says the Boulder police have already considered much of Smit's intruder theory.
And they have either discarded it or lowered it on the ladder of importance for various reasons. And they're not going to make their reasons public because they're still involved in an investigation.
While officials with the Boulder Police Department declined to be interviewed, last week they did issue a statement which said investigators have interviewed more than 600 people, 140 of them possible suspects. And the police say the case and the evidence have changed significantly since Smit left 2.5 years ago. And what about Lou Smit's interpretation of the evidence?
It's not an open and shut case on these marks now.
On Smith's theory about a stun gun, Dr. Robert Stratbucker is a consultant for the company that makes air taser stun guns. He says he cannot completely rule out stun gun marks on Jonbenet's back, but is nearly certain the marks on her face were caused by something else.
There is evidence of charring here. Almost looks like a burn. Stun gun marks with almost without exception, never cause burns.
As to Smith's claim that lab reports and photos show no evidence that Jonbenet wet the bed that night, sources close to the Boulder police say later tests did show traces of urine. And about Smith's theory on the timing of the severe injuries to Jonbenet, at our request, the chief medical examiner of Riverside County, California, Dr. Joseph Cohen, reviewed the Jonbenet autopsy report and photos. He says they are inconclusive.
I do not agree with Mr. Smit's conclusion that there's a specific sequence to the blunt force head trauma and the ligature strangulation. It's my belief that that separation cannot be made based on the autopsy findings.
And what about the evidence such as the footprints, the open window, the suitcase, even the DNA? Lawrence Schiller says the Boulder Police Department feels there's no way to tell if those pieces of evidence date from the night of the murder.
They've looked at all the evidence, the open window, the suitcase, the scuff mark on the wall, the fibers on the blanket, the DNA in her fingernails and panties and on her hands, and they feel that you can't date that evidence.
One of the few things that can be dated is the ransom note. Patsy Ramsey says she found it on the stairs the morning after the murder. It's considered perhaps the most critical piece of evidence.
The fact that the offender felt compelled to write this note goes to staging and creating a false motive and trying to deflect the investigation.
Former FBI profiler Greg McCrary says Smith's theory that a sexual predator would leave a ransom note makes no sense. He asks, was it a sex crime or a kidnapping for money? McCrary says only in staged situations do you see multiple motives, hoping one will stick. But another former FBI profiler, John Douglas, says Lou Smit's intruder theory is solid. Douglas was hired as a consultant by John Ramsey's attorneys in the early days of the case. From the start, he thought an intruder was responsible, especially because of the way Jonbenet's body was discovered.
If the crime scene was staged, why would you then have a family member like John Ramsey onstage the crime scene. If he killed his daughter and placed her in that wine cellar or Patsy Ramsey, he wouldn't have been the one to find his daughter. He wouldn't have been the one now to onstage the crime scene by removing duct tape from the mouth and loosening ligatures around the wrist of his child, and then carrying the child who's in full rigor upstairs and placing the child down on the floor. He wouldn't have done that. He would have left it there like a prop so that others could find the child.
Rocky Mountain News reporter Lisa Rickman, who's covered the case from the beginning, says Smit's theory is credible because he has no financial motivation and is beholden to no one.
How do you explain mystery DNA in her panties that also matches the DNA under her fingernails that belongs to a male individual who is not a member of her own family?
Police were suspicious of the Ramseys from the beginning, citing, among other things, their behavior after the crime, the ransom note, and their apparent lack of cooperation when it came to a formal police interview. I mean, if I'm a parent and I want to find out who murdered my child, God forbid, I would do everything in my power to help the police help solve the case.
Yes, Katie, but you would also go by what your lawyers advised you.
Do you think their lawyers did them a disservice in some ways by protecting them too much, at least in the court of public opinion?
Yes, from the court of public opinion, that is a perception. But from the lawyer's perception is they were trying to keep their clients out of jail.
What would you do if evidence surfaced that basically convicted John and Patsy Ramsey?
I would applaud it because the case would be solved.
Would you be surprised?
I would be real surprised that there would be evidence. That's why, after all this time, I don't think there is evidence. There's nothing to indicate that. The hardest part is to get beyond the Ramseys with the law enforcement agencies and to pursue the killer. That's the hard part. Yes, I would like to find the intruder. And yes, I believe an intruder is involved in this crime.
I know you have said you're not doing this to exonerate John and Patsy Ramsey, but you're doing it for one person.
That's right. That's for Jonbenet. And for the case, you have a responsibility to stand in her shoes.
The Ramseys are living in Atlanta and have filed libel suits against former and current Boulder police officers for their involvement in a book that implicates the Ramseys in the death of their own daughter. A number of law enforcement officials and Colorado Governor Bill Owens have criticized Lou Smit for going public, saying it's wrong to compromise an ongoing murder investigation. Smit says he hopes speaking out will prompt a new team of investigators to look at the case with fresh eyes. Meanwhile, the Boulder Police Department says the case is still open, as is the question, will we ever really know who killed Jonbenet? I'm Katie Couric. For all of us here at NBC News, good night.
And that concludes this evening's episode of One Solved Mystery. If you are enjoying the programming, please leave a comment below and consider hitting the like, subscribe, and notification bell so that you can be notified when new videos drop. Otherwise, I hope to see some of you next Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our next installment.